Hi everyone, this is Katie from Katie Loves Classic Books, and I'm here today with my February wrap-up. So February was an okay reading month. I didn't read too many books, but the quality of the books was awesome because I read some really good books in February, even if I didn't read too many. So, the first book I read in February was The Hours by Michael Cunningham. Um, the Hours was published in 1998, and I believe it won the Pulitzer Prize that same year. Anyways, The Hours was phenomenal. I absolutely love this book. This is a book that has stayed with me, and I think about it constantly, I feel. So The Hours is based on Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, or it kind of centers around Mrs. Dalloway. We have three storylines in The Hours. One is Virginia Woolf while she is writing Mrs. Dalloway. The second is a suburban housewife in like the late 1940s, early 1950s, who's reading Mrs. Dalloway. And the third perspective is from a woman named Clarissa, who is living in like the present day, which is like the 90s in this book. And her life mimics Mrs. Dalloway. And this was just done so beautifully. The writing is absolutely flawless, and the tribute to Mrs. Dalloway is done so well. It makes the style of Mrs. Dalloway a bit, and yet is such a beautiful story in its own right. And the themes that are touched on of love and life and death are done so well. There is so much to get out of this book. My favorite perspective was definitely that of Clarissa, Clarissa Vaughn, who is the woman in present day, who is based on Mrs. Dalloway. Her section I just absolutely fell in love with, but the other two sections were great as well. The suburban housewife perspective was probably my least favorite, but it was still quite good, and they tied into each other beautifully. There were passages in this that just stayed with me and that I found so beautiful, such as there's this one moment where Sally, a character in the present day story, she's heading home, and she wants to tell Clarissa how much she loves her, but to tell her that she loves her isn't enough. She wants to tell her how much she means to her, and that if she was to die and no longer be in her life, just the emptiness she would leave, how Sally would be okay, but she really wouldn't be okay. So she wants to tell Clarissa this feeling she has that is of love, but it's so much more. It's saying, I love you, but the space you take up in my life is so important to me, and if you left, the absence I would feel of you is so great. And so it's this kind of love that is touched on in that scene, and in another scene too, from a little boy's perspective, Richie to his mother in the 1950s section, about this love and this saying I love you that's almost desperate, and just the space you take up in people's lives, and what that means to them. And it's hard to put into words, but yeah, that was a beautiful moment. It's just sort of this feeling that's hard to describe, that he described well, that I'm not describing well, but Michael Cunningham describes very well. And there's this other moment that I love with Clarissa, and she's talking about at present day Clarissa. I just really love that perspective. Some of my favorite things are from that perspective. Um, and there's this moment with Clarissa, and she's talking about her adolescence and how there were these moments, and she thought they were perfect because they promised such happiness, and she loved those moments because the promise of more. But then she realized later on that it was those moments that were happiness. They didn't really promise more, that it was the moment itself that was happiness. And yeah, that was beautiful as well. So these are just little moments I loved from the book that are hard to describe, but just things that stayed with me. Anyways, this is a beautiful book. If you have any interest in reading it, I highly suggest you pick it up. But I think you need to read this in conjunction with Mrs. Dalloway. So if you're a fan of Mrs. Dalloway, please pick this up. If you haven't read either of them, read both of them. Read Mrs. Dalloway first, and then read this shortly after, however you'd like to do it. But I read Mrs. Dalloway last year, probably in September, I want to say. And it ended up being one of my favorite books of the year. And yeah, and I'm so glad that I decided to pick up The Hours as well, because this is so beautiful in its own right, and just really is quite a masterpiece. So that's The Hours. The second book I read in February, another fabulous, fabulous book, is A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. And this was published in 2013, and it was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize that same year. It might have been shortlisted too. I'm not sure. Does it say? It says it was a finalist here, so it may have been just longlisted, and it may have been shortlisted. So I don't know. It definitely deserved to be on the list though, because this is such a beautiful book. So this follows two different characters. First of all, a woman named Ruth, who is a writer living on this small island called, I think, Vancouver Island off the coast of Canada. And she is largely based on the author. You can tell she is a fictionalized version of the author, which is kind of interesting. I personally haven't seen that done before, and I wasn't sure whether I was going to like it or not, but I think I actually quite liked it. Anyway, so she's living off the coast of Canada, and she's walking on the beach one day, and she finds a Hello Kitty lunchbox. And inside this Hello Kitty lunchbox is a young teenage girl's diary. And the girl's name is Now, and she lives in Japan. And so we have alternating sections between Ruth and kind of her reading the diary and her thoughts on the diary and her life on the island, but it largely centers around her reading of Now's diary. And then the other perspectives are, or the other chapters are Now's diary and her kind of sharing her life in Japan. And Now's voice is absolutely fabulous. You get such a vivid, portrait of her as this teenage girl. She just seems so alive in these pages. Her voice is done really well. And Now lives quite a hard life in Japan. She's bullied, her father is suicidal, her family is struggling to make ends meet. So she's dealing with hardship at school, and she's dealing with hardship in her family. And she herself, you find out from the onset, is probably contemplating suicide as well. And so she's decided to write down what's been going on in her life in this diary. She originally sets out to write down the story of her great-grandmother named Jiko, who is a Zen Buddhist, anarchist, feminist nun, and who is just one of my absolute favorite characters that I've read about in a long time. And so she wants to write down her story, and she does end up talking about her a bit and how she's influenced her own life, but she mostly ends up talking about her own life and the hardships she goes through. And yeah, this was so phenomenal and impacted me so much. The theme of time was dealt with a lot in this book in a very interesting way. Um, there are subjects dealt with such as quantum physics um, and then also some Buddhism, like especially Zen Buddhism and stuff like that. And I found those really interesting themes that were dealt with. And like the title kind of suggests this idea of time, because now says at the beginning, it's like the first line in the book. I think she says, "Hi, my name is Now, and I'm a time being," and that means she's a being that lives in time. And so, time is delved into a lot, and also kind of questions of readers and writers and the connection they have. And this is sort of delved into in the time, because the connection between Ruth reading Now's diary and now writing it, and what is that connection exactly. And I thought that was done very well. And so it just asks a bunch of interesting questions, and it's a very philosophical book, and at once a very real book, and a very sad book that deals with some very difficult topics, but is yet so so inspiring, and brings joy to the reader at the same time. And like I said, Jiko, Now's Zen Buddhist great grandmother nun, was just a fabulous character. And because of all the talk about Zen and how she helped Now deal with some of the issues she was dealing with through meditation and whatnot, that I was even inspired to meditate more. That's something that I like to do. And yeah, after reading this book, I found myself meditating a lot more, and it even like influenced me to find that peace that Jiko kind of teaches Now to have as well. So anyways, this was a beautiful, beautiful book, and I highly recommend it if it sounds like something you'd like. This is something that I'd recommend to most people, because I just think it's a book that demands to be read, and it was very beautiful. So there's that. So the final book I read in February was a poetry collection. I'm quite a big fan of poetry. I've been trying to read at least one poetry collection a month. And so far this year, I'm doing just that, so that's a good start. And so the poetry collection of this month was Howl, Kaddish, and Other Poems by Allen Ginsberg. And Allen Ginsberg was a beat poet, and most of these poems were written and published in the 1950s, like 99.9%. I think there might be a couple that were early 60s, but mostly 1950s. And I gave this collection 4 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. Oh, I forgot to mention with the other books, A Tale for the Time Being and The Hours, I gave both of those 5 out of 5 stars on Goodreads because I absolutely love them. So this I gave 4 out of 5 stars. I struggled with deciding whether to give this 3 or 4 because I did enjoy this, not completely. So that's why I was deciding whether to give it 3 stars. But I think Allen Ginsberg is a really fabulous poet, and I recognize that, so I decided to give it 4. Anyway, so the poems in this collection deal with mental illness and kind of exploring consciousness, sometimes through drug use, sometimes not directly, questions of God and the universe, downfalls of the government, and whatnot. And some of my favorite poems are the ones that dealt more with consciousness and explorations of that. So those ended up being my favorite, like some of my favorite poems that dealt with these themes were Transcription of Organ Music. That was definitely one of my favorites. and Song, I believe. And yeah, and there were a few others that were good as well. Anyway, so those ended up being my favorite poems. And some of his other ones, dealing with drug use and downfalls of the government, were quite interesting as well. The poems that I didn't get on with as well, which I feel bad for saying, are the ones that dealt with mental illness, such as his very famous Kaddish. I recognize that it was a good poem and an important poem, but I just can't say that I enjoyed it or would want to read something like it again, which I feel a little bit harsh saying. And Kaddish kind of deals with his mother's mental illness, and it's quite a long poem, and it deals with her spiral downwards. And her being institutionalized and all this stuff. And he's written it after she's died, and it was heartbreaking, and it's important because it's real. You know, this is his experience. This has shaped him, and this happens to people. But it was very, very brutal to read about. So I didn't exactly love it, and I realize it's not something I particularly like reading about, although I recognize that it's important to read. So yeah, so that I didn't enjoy as much, but the poems about consciousness and explorations of that were very interesting. He's a very good writer, not too difficult to read. He reminds me of a more modern Walt Whitman, and I know that Walt Whitman was an idol of his, and he even has a poem about him called, I believe, A Supermarket in California. Yeah, a supermarket in California. And yeah, so you can kind of see that he loves Walt Whitman, and he seems like a more modern Walt Whitman, but a darker Walt Whitman. So I enjoyed his poetry, that's for sure. I did like and love some poems, but I just didn't love him. And I do think, speaking of Walt Whitman, I absolutely love him. He's one of my favorite poets, and I think I prefer Walt Whitman to Allen Ginsberg, only because he's not as dark, but there's definitely a lot of merit in this collection. And if you have any interest in poetry or, reading some literature from the Beat generation, then of course pick up some Allen Ginsberg, and perhaps you will like it. Alright, so those were the books I read in February. At the end of February, I started reading quite a long book, so that's why I didn't finish any more books that month. And I'm still reading it now, but I'm sure it will be in my March wrap-up, so look out for that. I haven't recorded a video in a really long time, so I apologize if I'm rusty, and I never really got that into it in the first place, so apologies for that. Let me know what you think of this video, and if you'd like to see more videos from me, and so talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know whether this was something that you liked. Let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. What else? Yeah, if you have any recommendations for me, I'm always open to recommendations, and I'm just always open to talking to people about books, so let me know what you think. Talk to me. I am also on Tumblr and Goodreads, which a lot of you may already follow me on, but I will have links to both of those down below, and I have written reviews of every book that I read, so if you're interested in any of those, perhaps I'll link those down below too, or you can find them on my Tumblr and Goodreads. Anyways, it was great talking to you all, and I'll see you all soon. Bye!